Now that your pattern is completely drafted, I want to take a minute and go through each of the pattern pieces that require some shaping so that you really have a clear understanding of what we were about to do. So I'll begin with the front because the shape of the front kind of leads the way everything else works. When we drafted our pattern, we made sure that our front shoulder and our back shoulder were cut at the same length. And when I say that, we're drafting along the cut edge right here. So if we assume that there is just shy of 3/8 inch seam allowance on each piece, 3/8 inch, I'm thinking 9 millimeters. So if we're thinking we've got a 3/8 inch seam allowance on each one, so when they overlap, so if this is a stitching line and this is a stitching line, then we're going to line those up. I'll match them up at the neckline. And now you can see that the back shoulder is slightly wider than the front shoulder. Even though our cut edges are exactly the same, the area where we will sew is actually different. And that's what we want, because what we'll end up doing is we'll ease this down a little bit in the process of stitching, and then we will also stretch the front shoulder. So this will come open and this will come down, and this will create essentially the same effect as that dart that most women's wear has in the back shoulder. We also do this on menswear, but menswear typically doesn't ever have the dart, so we're always easing the back shoulder in. And what that does is it provides a bit of a hollow for the trapezius muscle that is behind the shoulder. Consequently, on the front of the shoulder, where you have a relatively steep slope coming from the top of the shoulder down into the chest area, it's somewhat of a hollow rather than a hump. So in order to create a hollow, we'll stretch this here, and what that does is it sort of dishes out this little area a little bit and creates a concavity that allows it to sit better with the body. It flows into the shoulder really nicely. Now, peculiar to women's wear rather than men's wear, because this is a similar, we do the same manipulation on menswear, but in women's wear, you also typically will see a dart in the armhole in any one of a number of positions. So to accommodate that, we'll actually, from about here to here, we will ease out approximately 1 dedo. So that's 1/48 of the bust measurement is what we'll ease out of this area right here. And what that does is, I'm just going to show this example here. In that easing, we really can only manipulate a small portion. So I'm just going to snip into this pattern just so that you can see what happens. When we ease this down over that area, we essentially create this hollow that functions like a dart. And you can see it right there. It immediately will start to shape into the form of a bust. And that's what we want. And you'll also notice that it's quite high. And that's because the front of the stays is coming right across here. And we want the pattern to close out and form over the angle of the stays. Now we're dealing with a manipulated bust position to begin with. So this area, while it looks quite high, actually fits really nicely once the stays are in place and over the body. Additionally, because we have a curved center front line, we can accentuate that quite a bit by doing the same manipulation here along the apex of that curve in the front. So we can create a bit of bust shaping here, and we create a bit of bust shaping here through these two manipulations. And by doing that, we create a nice hollow for the bust to sit comfortably. To recap, before we go on, we're stretching the front shoulder, we're easing the back shoulder down, we're taking out some material here in the front armhole to create an equivalent of bust dart shaping. We're taking a little bit out here at center front to also create some bust dart shaping. We also would stretch this area right here, and we can, because it's on the straight grain, we really only can get a manipulation to about this point right here. And what happens is when we stretch this, we'll stretch this out as much as we can by about 3/4 of an inch from here to here. We'll try to get as much extra space in here as we can. And what that does is, I'll show you, I'm going to put 2 little clips in here, and then I'm going to fold this back. But what ends up happening is you have the side of the body sitting right here, but with the stretch and manipulation, when we fold it like this and stretch it out, that's about our 3/4 of an inch. And now you can see it's no longer a straight edge, it's actually curved, and it follows the natural curvature of the body in that area. So all of those things together with the front very much contour the garment into a 3-dimensional form that's going to flow really nicely over the body. And all of this shaping, the reasons we're doing this is so that we don't have to pull the garment absurdly tight to be worn. All of this shaping accommodates the form of the body. It's all based on the body's natural proportions, but in the long run, it means that the garment will hold its own shape according to what the body is, without making the body push out on the garment in order for it to have the right form. We'll move on to the sleeve pattern. So the sleeve, this is a 1/2 sleeve, which means that the outer shape of the sleeve and the inner shape of the sleeve are exactly the same. When we cut this pattern, in order to shape the bottom of the armpit, we used 1 dado and we kind of went up a little bit. So we have this flat section at the top of each piece of the back. And that's because that is our seam allowance. And when it's all sewn together, this should be one continuous line. We'll leave the sleeve open from here down. And that is so that we can have a wrist opening and that the wrist itself can be nice and snug. One of the things I think is important is to make sure that the wrists are tight enough. Particularly with women's wear in this time period, you see that the wrists and cuffs are very tight, and then you have the linens and laces and things coming out of the bottom of them. And we want to make sure that we create that same kind of fit. So this sleeve, when it's made, this will actually fold back, and then particularly in 17th century, mid-17th century, when bigger cuffs, linen cuffs with lace edging were popular, this gives a great place to like pin the linens to or baste them, whatever you need. That's the information on the sleeve. And then for the skirts, there really isn't a lot of mystery here. I mean, we have a front skirt and a back skirt, and we're going to sew them together, and then we'll put them on the body. I am going to true this pattern a little bit because you see this edge of the back and this edge of the front don't quite match. So I'm going to shorten up the front just a little bit so that we have the right size. And I'm just going to shave a little bit off and blend it in as smoothly as possible. Something else that we can do, knowing that this is center front right here, we have a point on our bodice, and we can shape the front of the skirt to accommodate the point of the bodice. And that way, we know that we'll have a nice smooth line and it's not going to kick out at all. So what I'll do first is I'll just line this up here so that I have a nice straight line along the front. And then somewhere kind of halfway between your center front line and your waist marking guideline, about halfway in there is where they'll cross. And at that point, then I'll just mark a little curvature. And I'll remember that that's the cut edge of this pattern. So there's 3/8 of inch seam allowance there, and then there's 3/8 inch seam allowance for the front. So it's not a whole lot that we're trimming off. And we can just blend it in to the waistline And then when we sew everything together, it'll sit really nicely. What we could also do is we can take this pattern here, and then we can use a rule, anything with a point on it, where we can just give ourselves little marks that we can work with. And that's the stitching line of the front. So that means that we'll cut here. It's not a lot, and it's optional. Like, the skirt will still hang well even if we don't do that. It will just have an extra fold. There'll be like an extra little fullness fold right here. All right, there we go. And we see this becomes a really interesting shape along the front, but it's just meant to accommodate this curvature right here and the little dip, and that gives us fullness still going around the back. We can measure along here and see that our lengths are good. I might need to shorten up the back just a little bit now that we have adjusted this, because this will get longer since we're cutting along the diagonal here. Let me measure this. So I have a seam allowance here at center front, and I have a seam allowance there, so I'm measuring from this point. That gives me 12.5. So then I also know that I have a seam allowance here and a seam allowance here. So I'll measure where I'm going to stitch and then make sure that I have the right number. So I'm going to start at center front. I'm going to make the ruler follow the shape along here. And what did I say, 12.5? So this is actually a little bit big, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. That gives me some room to work with the back skirt. So if I take my front and I match up the cut edges, I'm going to be following along here. And so there's my seam allowance. So I can just cut this there. And what I'll do to true that pattern up is I'll take my back skirt, and what I can swing it one way or the other to find the truest line that gives me a nice smooth run, and that puts it right here. Okay, so we're adjusting the front skirt so that everything will fit really nice and smooth. And this part of the process is something that I unfortunately left out of the Modern Maker Volume 2. This whole idea that you have to spend some time working with your pattern and checking it and truing it and making sure that these edges are going to sew together nicely, and using the pattern pieces to do these delicate shapings that are going to make everything sit much nicer. But that's what these videos are for, is to be able to teach those things in the correct context. The next thing that I want to talk about is the tailored padding that is going to go into this garment. Now, we don't have a collar, so we don't have to worry about any of the stuff that normally goes into the neckline. But what we do want is we want to have a little bit of a pad in this area, because once the shaping happens, the pad is really going to help hold it out into the form that it needs to be. So I'm going to measure, I will just take my thumb and I'll measure it about a finger width in from this cut edge, and then I'll take that straight up into the shoulder. So this is a 90-degree angle here, right? And then I will come down, I'll follow the shape of the armhole. I'm going down below any of the bust manipulations, almost to the waist, right? Like the waist is down here, like we're halfway there at this point. And this pad is so much bigger than you expect it to be. I'm going to miss the area that I'll be manipulating with the stretching, and I'm going to go right up into the side back seam. So you see this big wedge of a shape that we're going to be using for that pad. And what will happen is we'll do the manipulation here in the armhole, but then on the pad, we'll actually cut the pad here, and then we'll close in while we're doing it. So we get the same kind of curve of manipulation, and then the pad itself is shaped to push out against the garment so that it helps hold the form of the bust hollow without us having to do any work. We could put that slash here, we could put it here in front, or we could actually do both. Whatever we do, we absolutely have to manipulate the shape of the pad in order for it to continue to hold the shape of the garment. In order for the sleeves to go in nicely, we're also going to need to trim the pad away from the armhole. So I'm going to give this about 1/2 inch, possibly as much as 3/4 of an inch, depending on the thickness of my fabrics on the outside. You really don't need to have anything on the back, but if you were to put a pad on the back as well, you could just match this up as it comes across here. And then this is more or less the shape of the pad in the back. So we'll cut both of these out of a heavy wool, and we will pad stitch them onto our linen interlining, and then we'll baste the exteriors on and form the exterior to kind of almost upholstering the exterior shape onto the canvas. Because the canvas is what holds the form, and everything that goes on the outside is essentially a veneer that that we manipulate onto the canvas. One of the other things that we can do that you see in surviving garments is sometimes you'll see some bones put in, and we can go ahead and add some bones just to support the shape of the front. And they'll be somewhere in these locations. I usually do them as sort of a 3-prong flare coming out here so that one is aiming to the side of the bust, one is aiming to the center of the bust, and one aims to the front of the bust. And that way we're kind of accommodating all of the support that happens there and enabling this to lie very smoothly against the corset underneath.